My husband is living in luxury with his new girlfriend while I'm handling his debts. He told me to move on. He'll regret that soon. I'm done, he said, his eyes cold and unapologetic as he tossed the credit card bills in my face. He makes me happy. You're on your own now. He turned to leave, but I caught his arm, my grip as tight as a vice. You'll regret this, I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. I promise you that. He yanked his arm away, his lip curling in disgust. You're pathetic, you know that? Clinging to a man who doesn't want you anymore. I've found someone better, someone who actually makes me feel alive. And you're just a bitter, washed-up housewife with nothing to offer. Hey beautiful people. Your support means everything to me. Help me reach my next big milestone by hitting that subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and ensures you never miss an amazing video. Let's dive in. His words cut deep, but I refused to let him see me crumble. I straightened my spine and met his gaze head-on, my eyes blazing with barely contained fury. We'll see about that, I said evenly. I gave you the best years of my life, supported you through everything, and this is how you repay me? By running off with some cheap tramp and leaving me to deal with your mess? He scoffed, shaking his head. You just don't get it, do you? This isn't about you. It's about me and what I want. And I don't want you anymore. I want her. I want the life she can give me, not this boring, suffocating existence you've trapped me in. I felt like I'd been slapped. Trapped you? I loved you, you selfish bastard. I gave you everything and you threw it away like it meant nothing. He shrugged, his expression bored. Call it what you want. The truth is I've outgrown you. And now I'm moving on to bigger and better things. You should try it sometime. With that, he turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind him with a finality that echoed through the emptiness of the house we once shared. I stood there, trembling with a mixture of rage and despair, the credit card bills still clutched in my hand. How had it come to this? Just a year ago we'd been happy. Or so I'd thought. We'd been married for nearly a decade, and while things hadn't always been perfect, I'd never once doubted his love for me. But now, as I stared at the evidence of his betrayal in black and white, I realized just how blind I'd been. The bills were astronomical, a dizzying array of charges for five-star hotels, expensive dinners, and lavish gifts. He'd been living a double life, indulging in a fantasy with his mistress while I'd been at home, struggling to keep our heads above water. And now he had the audacity to walk away, leaving me to drown in the debts he'd racked up. But he'd underestimated me. He thought I was weak, that I'd simply collapse under the weight of his cruelty. He was wrong. As I stood there, surrounded by the shattered remnants of our life together, something inside me hardened into an unbreakable resolve. I would not let him destroy me. I would not let him win. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I'd never thought I'd have to use. Ethan, it's me. I need your help. Ethan was an old friend, a private investigator I'd met years ago when I'd worked as a paralegal. We kept in touch sporadically over the years, and I knew he had a reputation for being discreet and efficient. If anyone could help me uncover the truth about my husband's double life, it was him. What do you need? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to set in motion. I need you to find out everything you can about my husband's mistress. Who she is, where she works, what kind of assets she has. I want to know everything. Ethan was silent for a moment. Are you sure you want to go down this road, Jenna? It could get ugly. I closed my eyes, picturing my husband's smug, unrepentant face. I'm sure, I said firmly. He thinks he can just walk away and leave me holding the bag. But he's about to learn that actions have consequences. Okay, Ethan said finally. I'll see what I can dig up. But Jenna, be careful. Don't let this consume you. Too late for that, I said with a humorless laugh. He's already taken everything from me. My heart, my dignity, my future. All I have left is my anger, and I'll be damned if I let him take that too. I hung up the phone, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but one thing was certain. My husband was going to pay for what he'd done. He thought he could escape unscathed, but he was about to find out just how wrong he was. As I gathered up the bills and began to sort through them with a ruthless efficiency, a smile slowly spread across my face. It was not a pleasant smile, but one filled with dark promise. My husband had started this war, but I was going to finish it. And when the dust settled, only one of us would be left standing. He wanted me to move on. Well, I'd move on all right. But first I'd make sure he lived to regret ever crossing me. That was a promise I intended to keep no matter what it cost me in the end. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless phone calls. The more I dug into our finances, the worse it got. It wasn't just the credit card bills. There were unpaid loans, overdue taxes, and a mountain of debt that stretched back years. How had I not seen it before? How had I let it get this bad? I tried to piece together the shattered remnants of our life, but everywhere I turned, I was met with another dead end. The bank refused to help me, citing my husband's name on all the accounts. The credit companies laughed in my face when I begged for mercy. Even our supposed friends turned their backs on me, unwilling to get involved in the messy aftermath of our broken marriage. I was drowning and there was no one to throw me a lifeline. Late at night, when the silence of the empty house became too much to bear, I would pore over the bills, trying to make sense of the numbers that swam before my eyes. I'd always been good with money, careful and frugal, but this was beyond anything I'd ever dealt with before. The sums were staggering, the interest rates crippling. It was like trying to scale a mountain with no end in sight. I cut back on everything, living on ramen noodles and tap water, but it barely made a dent. The bills kept coming, each one a fresh blow to my already battered psyche. I started to dread the sound of the mailman's footsteps, knowing that he brought only more bad news. And through it all, my husband lived like a king. Ethan had come through with the information I'd requested, and what he'd uncovered made my blood boil. My husband's mistress was a wealthy socialite, the kind of woman who'd never had to worry about money a day in her life. Together they jetted off to exotic locales, dined at the finest restaurants, and bought whatever their hearts desired, all while I was left to pick up the pieces of the life they'd shattered. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But what could I do? I was just one woman, alone and powerless against the tidal wave of debt that threatened to consume me. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, the stress and anxiety eating away at me like a cancer. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think beyond the next bill, the next collection call. And then on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of overdue notices and final warnings, when a knock sounded at the door. I almost didn't answer it, assuming it was just another creditor come to harass me. But something made me get up and pad wearily to the front hall. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a tall, imposing man in a dark suit. He looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite place him. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" he asked, his voice deep and slightly accented. I nodded warily, my guard up. "Who are you?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, handing it to me with a slight bow. "My name is Luca Russo. I represent your husband's mistress, Miss Genevieve Belmont." I stared at him in shock, my mind reeling. What could this woman possibly want with me? "I don't understand," I said slowly. "What is this about?" Luca smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "May I come in? I have a proposition for you." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him enter. As he settled himself on the couch, I perched on the edge of the armchair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "What kind of proposition?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Luca leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into mine. "Miss Belmont is aware of your financial difficulties," he said smoothly. "She understands that your husband's actions have put you in an untenable position. She wants to help." I laughed bitterly. "Help? She's the reason I'm in this mess in the first place. If it wasn't for her, my husband would still be here and I wouldn't be drowning in his debts." Luca shook his head. "You misunderstand me, Mrs. Hawthorne. Miss Belmont is not responsible for your husband's choices. But she does feel a certain obligation to make things right. That's why she's prepared to offer you a deal." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What kind of deal?" Luca smiled again, and this time, there was a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "The kind of deal that could solve all your problems, Mrs. Hawthorne. The kind of deal that could give you your life back, and make your husband pay for what he's done." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a stack of papers, placing them on the coffee table in front of me. "All you have to do is sign on the dotted line," he said softly. "And then, my dear, the real fun begins." I hesitated, my mind whirling with possibilities. I knew I should say no, should tell this man to get out of my house and never come back. But the temptation was too great. The chance to finally be free of the debts that were crushing me, to make my husband suffer the way I had suffered. It was too much to resist. With a shaking hand, I reached for the pen. And as I signed my name, I felt a rush of dark satisfaction wash over me. My husband had started this war. But with Miss Belmont's help, I was going to finish it. And heaven help anyone who got in my way. As I sat across from Luca Russo, the weight of what I'd just done began to sink in. I'd made a deal with the devil, or at least with his mistress. What kind of person did that make me? What kind of depths had I sunk to, that I was willing to align myself with the woman who'd stolen my husband, just to get my revenge? But there was no going back now. The papers were signed, the die was cast. And as much as it pained me to admit it, I needed Miss Belmont's help. I couldn't take on my husband alone, not when he had all the money and all the power. I needed an ally, even if that ally was the last person I ever thought I'd turn to. Luca leaned back in his seat, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Excellent choice, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said smoothly. "I think you'll find that Miss Belmont can be a very valuable friend to have." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Luca's smile widened. "Now, my dear, we get to work. Miss Belmont has a plan, but she needs your help to pull it off. Are you ready to hear what she has in mind?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Tell me." Over the next hour, Luca laid out the details of the plan. It was audacious, risky, and more than a little bit illegal. But it was also brilliant in its simplicity. Miss Belmont had been watching my husband for months, gathering evidence of his shady business dealings and questionable financial practices. She had proof that he'd been embezzling money from his clients, funneling it into offshore accounts and using it to fund his lavish lifestyle with her. But she couldn't go public with the information, not without implicating herself in the process. That's where I came in. As his wife, I had access to his personal records, his computer, his phone. I could gather the evidence she needed to take him down, and in return she would make sure that I was taken care of financially. It was a gamble, but what did I have to lose? My husband had already taken everything from me. My home, my security, my dignity. All I had left was my anger and the burning desire to make him pay. And so I agreed. Over the next few weeks, I became a spy in my own home, rifling through my husband's papers, hacking into his email and tracking his every move. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, knowing that I held the key to his destruction in my hands. But as I dug deeper into his secrets, I began to realize just how little I knew about the man I'd married. The evidence of his betrayal was everywhere. In the love letters he'd written to his mistress, in the extravagant gifts he'd bought her with money that should have been mine. I found myself obsessing over every detail of their relationship, torturing myself with visions of their stolen moments together. And then one day I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a series of emails between my husband and a man named Sergei, discussing a shipment of illegal weapons that was set to arrive in the city in just a few days. My husband was involved in arms trafficking, and from the looks of it, he was in deep. I sat back in my chair, my heart racing. This was bigger than just a case of infidelity and financial fraud. This was dangerous, the kind of thing that could get people killed. And my husband was right in the middle of it. For a moment, I considered turning back, washing my hands of the whole sordid affair. But then I thought of all the years I'd wasted on him, all the love and trust I'd poured into our marriage, only to have it thrown back in my face. No, I couldn't let him get away with it. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. I printed out the emails and tucked them into my purse, my hands shaking as I dialed Luca's number. "I found something," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Something big. We need to meet now." An hour later, I was sitting in a dimly lit bar, sliding the emails across the table to Luca. He scanned them quickly, his eyes widening as he took in the details. "This is impressive, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said finally, his voice tinged with something like respect. "Miss Belmont will be very pleased with this information." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my ears. "What happens now?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Luca smiled, a slow, predatory grin that sent shivers down my spine. "Now, my dear, we take your husband down. And when we're done with him, he'll wish he never laid eyes on Genevieve Belmont. Or on you." I sat back in my seat, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over me. My husband had underestimated me, had thought he could cast me aside like yesterday's trash. But he was about to learn the hard way that I was not a woman to be trifled with. I had the power to destroy him, and with Miss Belmont's help, that's exactly what I was going to do. The other woman had started this war, but I was going to be the one to finish it. And when the dust settled, only one of us would be left standing. And it sure as hell wasn't going to be my lying, cheating husband. I left the bar with Luca's words ringing in my ears, my mind racing with possibilities. I had the evidence I needed to take my husband down, but I knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. If I was going to make him pay for what he'd done, I needed to hit him where it hurt: his wallet, his reputation, and his precious mistress. Over the next few days, I threw myself into plotting my revenge with a single-minded focus that bordered on obsession. I barely slept, barely ate, my every waking moment consumed with thoughts of how to make my husband suffer the way he'd made me suffer. I started by gathering more evidence, hacking into his bank accounts and tracing the flow of money from his illicit dealings. I discovered that he'd been funneling cash into a series of shell companies, using them to finance his lavish lifestyle and shower his mistress with gifts. It was the smoking gun I needed to prove that he'd been embezzling from his clients, and I knew it would be the key to bringing him down. But I didn't just want to ruin him financially. I wanted to destroy his reputation, to make sure that he could never show his face in polite society again. And for that, I needed to enlist the help of some old friends. I reached out to my former colleagues from my days as a paralegal, the ones who'd always suspected that my husband was up to no good. They were more than happy to help me dig up dirt on him, feeding me information about his shady business practices and the clients he'd scammed over the years. I compiled it all into a dossier, a damning indictment of his character that I knew would be his undoing. But the final piece of the puzzle was his mistress, the woman who'd stolen him away from me. I knew that if I could turn her against him, if I could make her see him for the lying, cheating bastard he really was, it would be the ultimate revenge. And so, I set my sights on Genevieve Belmont, determined to uncover every dirty secret in her past. I hired private investigators to dig into her background, to find out everything they could about her family, her finances, and her many lovers. What I found was a goldmine of scandal and impropriety, the kind of information that could ruin her just as surely as it would ruin my husband. Armed with this knowledge, I set my plan in motion. I leaked the information about my husband's illegal dealings to the press, watching with grim satisfaction as his face splashed across the front pages of every newspaper in town. I sent the dossier on his shady business practices to his clients and his competitors, watching as they turned on him like a pack of hungry wolves. And then I went after his mistress. I sent her copies of the love letters he'd written to me, the ones where he'd sworn his undying devotion and promised to love me forever. I included photos of our wedding day, our honeymoon, the life we'd built together, all the things he'd thrown away for a cheap fling with a socialite. I watched as Genevieve's world crumbled around her, as the society pages turned on her and her so-called friends abandoned her in droves. I reveled in her humiliation, in the knowledge that she was finally getting a taste of the pain she'd inflicted on me. But I saved the best for last. I arranged a meeting with Genevieve under the pretense of offering her a deal. I told her that I had evidence that could ruin my husband, that I was willing to share it with her if she helped me take him down. She was desperate, backed into a corner, and I knew she'd jump at the chance to save herself. And so she agreed. Together we set the trap for my husband, luring him to a hotel room with the promise of a lucrative business deal. When he arrived, he found himself face to face with me, Genevieve, and a team of federal agents, all armed with the evidence of his crimes. The look on his face as they slapped the cuffs on him was something I'll never forget. The shock, the anger, the dawning realization that he'd been outplayed by the two women he'd wronged the most. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, and I savored every second of it. As they led him away, I turned to Genevieve, my lips curled in a smirk. "I told you I'd make him pay," I said, my voice cold and hard. "And now he'll spend the rest of his life rotting in a cell, knowing that it was his own greed and arrogance that put him there." She looked at me with something like respect, a grudging admiration for the woman who'd outmaneuvered her at every turn. "You're a force to be reckoned with, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I almost feel sorry for him." I laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed off the walls of the empty hotel room. "Don't waste your pity on him," I said, my eyes glinting with a savage kind of triumph. "He brought this on himself. And now he's going to pay for every last one of his sins." And with that, I turned and walked away, my head held high and my heart finally free of the weight of his betrayal. My revenge was complete and I was ready to face whatever came next. My husband had tried to break me, but in the end I was the one who'd broken him. And that was a victory that no one could ever take away from me. The news of my husband's arrest spread like wildfire. The scandal splashed across every front page and news channel in the city. The once respected businessman, the darling of the social scene, was exposed as a fraud and a criminal, his carefully crafted facade crumbling to dust in the face of the overwhelming evidence against him. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over me with every new revelation. The emails, the bank statements, the incriminating photos. It was all laid bare for the world to see, a damning indictment of the man I'd once loved with all my heart. But as the days turned into weeks and the media frenzy showed no signs of abating, I began to feel a creeping sense of unease. The man they were describing in the papers, the monster who'd cheated and lied and stolen his way to the top. Was that really the same man I'd married? The same man who'd held me close on our wedding night and promised to love me forever? The truth was, I didn't know anymore. The more I learned about my husband's double life, the more I realized just how little I'd really known him. The man I'd thought I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, he'd been nothing more than a mirage, a shimmering facade that had hidden the ugly truth beneath. And now, as the trial loomed on the horizon and the evidence mounted against him, I found myself questioning everything I'd ever believed about our marriage. Had any of it been real? Or had I just been a pawn in his game, a convenient cover for his lies and his crimes? The day of the trial arrived, and I steeled myself to face the man who'd shattered my world into a million pieces. I walked into the courtroom with my head held high, determined to show him that he hadn't broken me, that I was stronger than he'd ever given me credit for. But when I saw him sitting there at the defense table, his once proud shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt a sudden rush of emotion that I couldn't quite name. Anger, yes, and betrayal and hurt. But something else too, something that felt strangely like pity. As the trial unfolded and the evidence was presented, I watched my husband's facade crumble even further. The confident, charming man I'd once known was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a broken shell of a person who could barely meet my eyes across the courtroom. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, his mistress took the stand. Genevieve Belmont, the woman who'd stolen my husband and shattered my life, and the woman who'd helped me bring him to justice. She was poised and elegant as ever, but there was a brittleness to her now, a fragility that hadn't been there before. As she recounted the sordid details of their affair, the lavish gifts and the whispered promises, I saw the cracks in her own facade beginning to show. And then, in a stunning twist that sent shockwaves through the courtroom, she turned on him. With cold, clinical precision, she laid out every last one of his crimes, every dirty secret and hidden misdeed. She held nothing back, her voice steady and unwavering as she painted a picture of a man consumed by greed and hubris, a man who'd stop at nothing to get what he wanted. I watched my husband's face as she spoke, saw the dawning horror and disbelief in his eyes as he realized just how thoroughly he'd been betrayed. In that moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered all the years of lies and deceit, all the pain and heartbreak he'd put me through. I remembered the debts and the shame, the nights I'd spent crying myself to sleep while he was out living the high life with his mistress. And I knew that he deserved every bit of what was coming to him. In the end, the verdict was swift and decisive. Guilty on all counts, with a sentence that would see him spending the rest of his days behind bars. As the judge handed down the ruling, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. It was over. The battle was won, and my husband's facade was shattered beyond repair. He'd been exposed for the fraud and the liar that he was, and he'd pay the price for his crimes. But even as I savored the victory, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hollowness, a void where my heart had once been. My marriage, my life, it had all been built on a foundation of lies, and now that the truth had come out, I wasn't sure what was left. I walked out of the courtroom that day a different woman than the one who'd walked in. I was harder, colder, more cynical than I'd ever been before. The scales had fallen from my eyes, and I knew that I could never go back to the life I'd once had. But I also knew that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. I'd survived the worst that life had thrown at me, and I'd come out the other side. I might have been broken, but I wasn't beaten, and I never would be again. As I stepped out into the bright sunlight of the courthouse steps, I felt a sense of purpose wash over me. My husband's facade might have been shattered, but mine was just beginning to take shape. I was ready to face whatever came next. And heaven help anyone who tried to stand in my way. The weeks after the trial passed in a blur of media interviews and legal meetings, as I tried to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. The press hounded me relentlessly, eager for any scrap of information about the scandalous downfall of my once powerful husband. At first, I reveled in the attention, basking in the glow of my hard-won victory. I gave interviews to anyone who would listen, spilling every sordid detail of my husband's betrayal and my own quest for vengeance. I wanted the world to know what he'd done, to see him for the monster he really was. But as the days turned into weeks and the spotlight began to fade, I found myself struggling to adjust to my new reality. The truth was, for all the satisfaction I'd felt in bringing my husband to justice, there was a part of me that felt strangely empty inside. I'd spent so long focused on my revenge, on making him pay for what he'd done to me, that I'd never really stopped to think about what would come next. Now that it was all over, I felt like I was drifting, searching for a purpose in a world that had been turned upside down. The money helped, of course. With my husband's assets frozen and his company in shambles, I'd become the sole beneficiary of his vast fortune. I had more money than I could ever spend in a lifetime, and at first I reveled in the freedom it brought me. I bought a new house, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city where I could escape the prying eyes of the media. I traveled the world, indulging in every luxury and excess that money could buy. I even started a foundation in my own name, dedicated to helping women who'd been betrayed and abandoned by the men they loved. But even as I poured myself into my new life, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The truth was, for all the trappings of wealth and success, I was lonely. I'd lost more than just my husband when I'd embarked on my quest for vengeance. I'd lost my friends, my family, and my sense of self. The people who'd once been closest to me had turned their backs when the scandal broke, too afraid of being tainted by association to stand by my side. Even my own parents had distanced themselves, too ashamed of their daughter's public humiliation to offer any comfort or support. And then there were the nightmares. Night after night, I woke up screaming, haunted by visions of my husband's face twisted in rage and betrayal. I saw myself as he must have seen me in those final moments, a cold and ruthless monster who'd stop at nothing to get what she wanted. I tried to tell myself that it was all worth it, that the price of my vengeance was a small one to pay for the justice I'd won. But in the darkest hours of the night, when the doubts and the fears came creeping in, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. Had my quest for revenge really been worth the cost? Had I sacrificed too much in my pursuit of justice, my own happiness and peace of mind among them? I didn't have any easy answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep waking up every morning feeling like a stranger in my own skin, haunted by the ghosts of my past and the choices I'd made. And so I made a decision. I sold the mansion and the cars, donated the money from my foundation, and booked a one-way ticket to a place where no one knew my name or my story. I needed to start over, to find a way to make peace with what I'd done and who I'd become. It wasn't easy, of course. There were days when the pain and the regret threatened to overwhelm me, when I wondered if I'd ever be able to look at myself in the mirror again without feeling the weight of my own sins. But slowly, day by day, I began to heal. I found a therapist who helped me work through my trauma and my guilt, who taught me how to forgive myself for the choices I'd made in the heat of my anger and pain. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, using my own experiences to help other women who'd been through similar struggles. And in time, I even started to date again, opening myself up to the possibility of love and connection after so many years of isolation and mistrust. It wasn't a perfect ending by any means. I still had my scars, both physical and emotional, and there were days when the memories of what I'd been through threatened to drag me back down into the darkness. But I was learning to live with them, to accept them as a part of who I was and who I'd become. Because in the end, that was the real price of my vengeance. Not the money or the status or the public humiliation, but the person I'd had to become to see it through. I'd had to harden my heart and sharpen my claws, to become a version of myself that I barely recognized and wasn't always sure I liked. But I was learning to make peace with her too. To accept that she was a part of me, just like every other version of myself I'd ever been, the naive young bride, the betrayed wife, the avenging fury. They were all me, for better or for worse, and I was slowly learning to embrace them all. Because that was the only way forward, the only way to find the happiness and the peace I'd been chasing for so long. Not by running from my past or trying to erase it, but by facing it head-on and learning to live with the choices I'd made. It was a hard road, and there were still days when I wasn't sure I had the strength to keep walking it. But I knew now that I had no other choice. I'd paid the price for my vengeance, and now it was time to start living with the consequences. And maybe, just maybe, to start building something better from the ashes of what I'd lost. Months turned into years as I slowly began to rebuild my life, piece by painstaking piece. It was a journey of self-discovery and healing, a chance to rediscover the woman I'd been before my world had shattered into a million jagged shards. I threw myself into my work at the women's shelter, finding a sense of purpose and fulfillment in helping others navigate the same struggles I'd faced. I listened to their stories, held their hands as they cried, and celebrated their victories as if they were my own. In them, I saw echoes of my own journey, the pain, the fear, the desperate longing for a way out. But I also saw something else, a strength and resilience that took my breath away. These women had been through hell, had survived things that would have broken most people beyond repair. And yet here they were, still standing, still fighting, still daring to hope for something better. They inspired me in ways I never could have imagined, and slowly, day by day, I began to feel a spark of that same strength kindling within me. I started to see myself through their eyes, not as a victim or a broken thing, but as a survivor, a warrior, a force to be reckoned with. And as I grew stronger, I began to make changes in my own life as well. I started taking better care of myself, eating well and exercising regularly, nurturing my body and mind in ways I'd neglected for far too long. I took up hobbies I'd always been too busy for: painting, gardening, even learning to play the piano. But perhaps the biggest change of all was in my relationships. For so long I'd closed myself off from the world, too afraid of being hurt again to let anyone get close. But as I began to heal, I started to realize just how much I'd been missing. I reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with, rekindling connections that had once meant the world to me. I even started dating again, opening myself up to the possibility of love and companionship after so many years of isolation. It wasn't always easy, of course. There were still days when the old fears and doubts would come creeping back in, when I'd catch myself retreating back into my shell. But I was learning to push through them, to remind myself of how far I'd come and how much I still had to offer the world. And as the years passed, I began to see the fruits of my labor in ways I never could have imagined. The women's shelter I'd poured my heart into was thriving, helping countless women and children escape the cycle of abuse and build new lives for themselves. My friendships were deeper and more meaningful than ever, a source of love and support that sustained me through even the darkest of times. And then one day something unexpected happened. I received a letter in the mail, a simple white envelope with no return address. At first I almost didn't open it. After all this time I'd learned to be wary of surprises. But something told me this was different, and so, with trembling hands, I tore open the seal and began to read. It was from my ex-husband, the man who'd once shattered my world into a million pieces. He was writing from prison, where he'd been serving out the remainder of his sentence. The letter was short and to the point, but the words still hit me like a punch to the gut. He was sorry, he said. Sorry for all the pain he'd caused me, sorry for the lies and the betrayal and the years of deceit. He knew he had no right to ask for my forgiveness, but he wanted me to know that he'd spent every day since his conviction trying to become a better man, to make amends for the wrongs he'd done. He was getting out soon, he said. And he wanted to see me, to apologize in person and to try to make things right. I stared at the letter for a long time, my mind reeling with 1,000 conflicting emotions. A part of me wanted to tear it up and throw it away, to tell him that he'd lost the right to ask anything of me the moment he'd destroyed our marriage. But another part of me, the part that had been through so much and come out the other side, knew that I needed to face him, to look him in the eye and tell him once and for all that I was done letting him control my life. And so, with a deep breath and a silent prayer for strength, I picked up the phone and dialed the number he'd given me. It was time, I knew, to finally close this chapter of my life, to lay to rest the ghosts of my past and start looking towards the future. I didn't know what that future would hold, or where this road would take me in the end. But I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to find out. I was ready to rise from the ashes of my old life and start building something new, something better, something that was all my own. And as I listened to the ringing of the phone and waited for my ex-husband to answer, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a calm certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. I had walked through the fire and come out the other side, stronger and wiser and more alive than I'd ever been before. And whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I had the strength to face them head-on. Because I was a survivor. I was a warrior. I was a force to be reckoned with. And nothing and no one could ever take that away from me again. The day of the meeting arrived and I found myself standing outside a small coffee shop in the heart of the city, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for my ex-husband to arrive. I'd chosen the location carefully, a neutral ground where we could talk without the weight of our shared history hanging over us. As I waited, I found myself fidgeting with the sleeve of my jacket, my nerves getting the best of me. It had been years since I'd seen him, years since I'd looked into the eyes of the man who'd once been my entire world. I didn't know what to expect, didn't know how I would feel when I finally came face to face with him again. But before I could lose my nerve, I heard a familiar voice calling my name, and I turned to see him walking towards me, his face lined with a mixture of nervousness and hope. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer and his face more weathered than it had been on our wedding day. But there was still a glimmer of the man I'd once loved in his eyes, a hint of the charm and charisma that had first drawn me to him all those years ago. We sat down at a table by the window, 2 steaming cups of coffee between us, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The weight of all the years and all the pain hung heavy in the air, and I could feel my throat tightening with emotion as I struggled to find the words. But finally he broke the silence, his voice soft and hesitant as he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a sincerity that took my breath away. "I know I hurt you and I know there's nothing I can say or do to take that back. But I need you to know that I'm truly, deeply sorry for everything I put you through." I nodded, my own voice barely above a whisper as I replied. "I know," I said. "And I appreciate you saying that. But I need you to understand something. I've spent the last few years rebuilding my life, learning to stand on my own 2 feet again. And I'm not going to let anyone, not even you, take that away from me." He nodded, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I understand," he said. "And I'm not here to try to win you back or to ask for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve either of those things. I just wanted to see you, to tell you in person how sorry I am and to let you know that I've changed. I'm not the same man I was when I hurt you." We talked for hours, catching up on the years we'd missed and slowly, tentatively, finding our way back to a place of understanding and respect. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the old wounds threatened to reopen, when the anger and the hurt came rushing back to the surface. But as we talked, I began to realize something. The man sitting across from me wasn't the same man who'd broken my heart all those years ago. He'd grown and changed just as I had, and while the scars of our past would always be there, they no longer defined us. And so, as the sun began to set outside the coffee shop window, I made a decision. I reached across the table and took his hand in mine, my voice steady and clear as I spoke. "I forgive you," I said, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar on my tongue. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of the anger and the pain that's been weighing me down for so long. I'm ready to move on, to leave the past behind and start living for myself again." He nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he squeezed my hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much that means to me." We hugged then, a brief, tentative embrace that felt like the closing of a chapter and the beginning of something new. And as we walked out of the coffee shop and into the fading light of the evening, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness was a process, not a destination, and I knew there would still be days when the old pain and anger would come creeping back in. But I also knew that I was strong enough to face whatever challenges lay ahead, that I had the tools and the resilience to keep moving forward no matter what life threw my way. And so, as I walked down the street and into the bustling heart of the city, I felt a smile spreading across my face, a sense of joy and excitement bubbling up inside me. The final chapter of my story was just beginning, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take me. I knew there would be ups and downs, twists and turns that I could never see coming. But I also knew that I was ready for whatever lay ahead, because I was no longer defined by my past, by the choices and the mistakes that had once threatened to break me. I was my own woman now, strong and brave and full of hope for the future. And nothing and no one could ever take that away from me again. As I rounded the corner and stepped out into the waiting world, I felt a sense of endless possibilities stretching out before me, a world of opportunities and adventures just waiting to be explored. And I knew with a certainty that filled me from head to toe, that I was ready to embrace it all, the good and the bad, the joys and the sorrows, the laughter and the tears. Because this was my life, my story, my final chapter. And I was going to make it one hell of a ride.